Yes, I'm all glad you could join us today. My name is Kiera Logan. I'm a third-year English major and journalism minor with the professional writing minor program, and I'm super honored to be able to moderate our event today. And just a few housekeeping things. This event is recorded, and the recording will be available to watch on HFA's YouTube channel. And we'll also be writing up an article for the HFA website and social media pages, so be sure to check those out. And last thing, I plan on leaving about 15 minutes for questions at the end, so please put your questions in the chat and they will be monitored by one of our HFA interns, and we will pose them to the professors at the end. This is the fall installment of our HFA Speak series, which highlights people, departments, centers, and programs, all under the umbrella of the Division of Humanities and Fine Arts. We will be focusing on the post-election results from multiple different perspectives and what that means for the future of our country. Before I get ahead of myself, please let me introduce our speakers. We have three qualified panelists with us today that offer a range of ideas, opinions, and insights to what we might expect in the years to come after last week's somewhat surprising election results. So first, we have Professor Juliana Peroni. She's a UCSB history professor who focuses on the 19th century U.S. history, slavery, law, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor. We're excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes. We are also hosting Professor Morzial Boscali. I had it earlier, who is a UCSB English professor affiliated with Feminist Studies and Comparative Literature. Thank you so much for your participation, Professor. Welcome.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Professor Joseph Blankholm, who is a religious studies professor here at UCSB, who focuses on secularism and atheism and American religion. Welcome to the panel.
Thank you.
Perfect. We're going to start with a question for Professor Boscali. How might the outcome of the election shape policies affecting women, particularly in areas such as reproductive rights, workplace equity, and access to health care?
Well, after the Supreme Court overturning Roe versus Wade in 2022, I'm thinking about the access. I want to talk about the access to abortion and to women's health, care has become restricted, particularly in a number of states. And it's become more difficult to obtain. So that's the major problem. And consequently, the lives and the health of women have been put in danger. So if the administration will not implement a nationwide ban on abortion, we can anticipate that there are going to be more restrictions, okay, to begin with. As it happens already in some states. I'd like to add a couple of things on the question of gender at large, not just women here. Another important issue is the possible rollback of LGBTQ. Let's see, where was I? I was talking about LGBTQ and transgender people rights. That's another thing that might become a problem. The restriction of these rights might loom at the horizon. If I remember correctly, during the first Trump term, transgender people were banned from the military. I think I got it right. So now there's the promise of a more aggressive attack on their rights. And you can think of the call to federal agencies to end programs that promote gender transition. You can think about the cutting of federal funds for hospitals which provide gender-affirming care, or just the refusal to legally recognize transgender people. At large, we are living, very unfortunately, in a time of profound anti-feminist backlash. And this backlash has been amplified, exacerbated by the rhetoric circulating during the campaign, I think. And this rhetoric, in turn, has given the visibility and has normalized a sexist and gynophobic and transphobic view of gender. This is in relation to women. This is the idea that women are not. So we are reinventing the wheel, right? We are back at square one. That women are not equal to men. They're inferior. They're minors who need to be protected, which is another verb for controlled, whether we want it or not, I'm quoting. Whether we want it or not is incredibly ominous, is an incredibly ominous line because it implies violence and coercion. Whether we want it or not, we are going to be protected. And so this claimed inferiority of women results in the idea that women are by nature, it's a given. They are mothers, they even better if they stay home, and even much better if they shut up. So that's a problem. I can see this is it's a rhetoric that fuels violence against women, that takes us back to decades ago, to the 50s and before, as if the 60s and the feminist struggles that have gone on during the last 40 years did not happen. Um, I don't think that the women in this country or in other countries are going to take this idea without responding. Can I say another thing? There was an article a few days ago in The Guardian by Rebecca Solnit, who explains in this article the cultural and economic causes of toxic masculinity circulating in American culture. And she's unpacking and discussing men's anger to women and men's resentment, the male voters' resentment to women, which is reflected again in this rhetoric. Think about Tucker Carlson and Daddy coming back home, and think about the cat ladies. What was it? Think about Elon Musk's pronatalist ideology. But Solnit also concludes that article by saying that women are also angry for having their rights and freedoms taken away from them. And she ends up by saying feminists can lash back. And I think that maybe one thing that might emerge and might come out of this present and near future situation, perhaps it's a stronger, more cohesive feminist movement.
Thank you so much for
Yeah.
speaking on that anti-feminism backlash that I feel like so many women have been feeling post-election. I'm going to turn the next question to Professor Peroni. My question for you is, are the election results as unprecedented in the history of democracy as many are claiming it to be? And are there risks to the rule of law and the Constitution?
So historians are reticent, to say the least, about calling anything unprecedented. So I won't say that. And I'm a scholar of the Civil War era, and so I've seen elections that produce really significant consequences. The election of 1860, arguably, sort of cementing the final sort of nail in the coffin in terms of the path to the Civil War. So the stakes have to be awfully high for me to think about things in terms of being unprecedented. And I would also say, in terms of this state, at least of American democracy, there are whole populations of Americans for whom democracy and the sort of promises of American freedom and equality have just not been met in the past, and arguably continue for that to be the case. So I sort of think about this as it's more that what we're witnessing, what looks like a sort of return to certain past ideologies in terms of a very sort of nativist, anti-immigration, very conservative social values, as Maurizia has said, that target women, that target LGBTQ Americans. That feels older to us because it is older, and I think that feels unprecedented, but probably just in our lifetimes, not actually. And I actually think that looking at groups that have struggled to force the United States to hold itself to the promises of citizenship, equality, whether that be non-white Americans or feminists, actually offer us a bit of a roadmap for thinking about the United States and the struggle for attaining the promises that we've sort of laid out for ourselves as being a really long one. And to think about not any, I mean, this is hard in the moment. I grant you, especially when people are facing potential harms or threats to their safety, even. We can think about undocumented people, for example. But the road is long and not straight. So moving towards something different sometimes means taking a step backwards. So precedented, unprecedented doesn't really work because history is not linear. And here I think there are histories within the United States context that you can look at, moments that you can look at that are instructive in a variety of different ways. One being, right, this kind of struggle. I am particularly concerned as a historian of the Reconstruction era at the permissiveness that the Trump administration showed in 2016, and I expect to see again of social violence, unrest. So, for example, in 2016, I wrote a piece about the uprising in Charlottesville, describing that, you know, when the United States government chooses to stamp out groups like the KKK, it can do so. But when it gives an opening for those groups, they sort of emerge and sort of return to the surface. And at that time, the then head of the KKK, David Duke, said he felt compelled, and KKK members felt compelled to act, and that's what Donald Trump's presidency signaled to them. And January 6th, I think, only amplified that kind of sentiment among groups. So there's a whole lot that's unprecedented, actually, or that is not unprecedented, actually. And I'm concerned that some of the things that I recognize from my experience as a historian of the 19th century are going to be more common and prevalent in society today. We are not, as in our lifetimes, used to that, seeing that kind of thing, right? The violence that we saw in 2016, for example, was jarring for a reason. But I fully expect to see more of it.
Thank you for distinguishing that feeling of unprecedentedness versus actually unprecedented times. And I really like your saying of the road is long and not straight. So thank you so much, Professor. Next, I'm going to move to Professor Blankholm for your first question. Professor, yours is kind of a loaded one. Now that Trump has won the election, do you think religious nationalists will occupy positions of power or be able to wield power and move more towards a theocracy? Does the rise in secularism provide a check on this, or do non-religious people have less power now?
Thank you. Yeah, several parts to the question. So the first one is, I think about how much Christianity is going to become maybe more public and powerful, and how much people who are conservative Christians in particular are going to be holding positions of power. So I think that we're going to see that. But we're also seeing the realization of a much longer strategy that involves the courts in particular, because religion is so often, when it's really substantive, regulated by the courts because it's mentioned multiple times in the Constitution. So we have the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. Establishment Clause is about whether or not the government can favor a particular religion, can endorse a particular religion, can privilege one over others. And the Free Exercise Clause is about individuals' religious freedoms. So I think we're going to see a lot more things that kind of toe the line on a traditional interpretation of the Establishment Clause as being a strict separation of church and state. Although the fact is, we've never had that strict separation of church and state in practice. Are we going to see more public religion in a symbolic sense? Yeah, probably. Absolutely. It's a big part of Republican branding. So it's having certain Christian values, emphasizing those things, invoking language of Christianity. That's a big part of what Republicans do. So that's definitely going to be more public. There's this longer strategy in the courts of creating more space for religious freedom and counting more things as religious freedom. So I think we're going to continue to see a lot more of that. And then it's good to remember, as Trump enters his second term, he's going to end up having appointed somewhere between a quarter to a third of federal judges to lifetime appointments. And so they're going to be doing the interpretive work from the Supreme Court on down of what counts as religion and what kind of religious protections people have. So two easy, quick examples of, I think, where this is going to be a point of tension is sometimes religious freedom increasingly means the right to discriminate. So we've seen that in recent cases about whether people who are, for instance, making cakes or designing websites have to do so for queer people if they are Christians and they say that that's against their religion. So far in that area of creative expression, the court's been very clear. This new court that we have that Trump has appointed 3 justices to, that court has said you have that right to discriminate. But it's not just about public accommodation, is what that's called. It's also about carving holes into things like the Civil Rights Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the court system that we have is going to extend way beyond Trump's second term, and he's going to have a huge hand in shaping it. There's going to be more religious freedom, more things are going to count as religion and be protected as freedom. And we're going to be, I think, if we haven't been paying attention, surprised at the kind of freedoms that allows, because religious freedom often means exception to state authority. So it means exception to the Civil Rights Act, exception to the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we're going to be seeing a lot more of that. I think the second part of the question is really, I think, in part about demography. So yes, America is becoming less religious, but we can parse that a little bit. So atheists are more loyal to the Democratic Party than evangelicals are to the Republican Party. It's more like mid 80% for atheists, and it's like low 80% for evangelicals when we look at a lot of the numbers more specifically. Agnostics, it's a little bit less. Another group that we often consider non-religious is the nothing in particulars. They're less so. They're less loyal to the Democratic Party. Is demography going to be destiny there? I think that the Democratic Party is going to be really foolish if it thinks that that's the case, because it's already hopefully learning a lesson about not paying attention to a sort of, I don't know if you want to call it a multiracial working class coalition that squandered, but I don't think that's the worst way to describe it. So the other part of that then is that we see that more educated people are less religious. And if you look at the exit polls, the Democratic Party did better among those who are more educated. It did better among those who have higher household income. So whether or not the Democratic Party wants to speak about or engage with religion may actually have a lot to do with whether it's able to woo working class voters in the future. So I think the Democratic Party being wary of religion or thinking of religion as the problem isn't really going to solve the Democratic Party's problems going forward. And so hopefully they're able to find a way to tell stories that can appeal to both religious and non-religious people if they want to have a future in American politics. And then Republicans are picking up some of those nothing in particulars. They did so in this last election, especially young men. And so that group that's nothing in particular is kind of undecided on a lot of issues, and they're going to be up for grabs. So thank you.
That was an amazing answer. It actually transitions into my next question beautifully. So thank you, Professor Blankholm. My next question is for any and all of our panelists. You guys are more than welcome to answer my next question, which is, many experts say we are headed for an autocratic or authoritarian regime, and what might that look like under Trump and his administration?
I can start answering that if it's okay. Yes, the authoritarian tendency, I don't know if it will be implemented in what form it will appear exactly during the time of this administration. But there are signals, and the signals are worrisome somehow. There is, first of all, this desire that Juliana started talking about, the question of immigration. There is this question of this desire, this intent to purge, to divide, to eliminate people who are considered, not that they're considered as other, as non-belonging. And obviously here the question of immigration is definitely a case in point. there are more alarming signals for me thinking about it. For instance, I'll give you this idea, this example, the list of enemies, which I don't know if they'll end up being prosecuted or put in jail, as Trump is announcing. I don't know, but just the fact that a list of enemies exists, that's another signal, according to me. They putting in positions of power as only people who are loyal to the president. Certainly, I mean, the question of deporting undocumented. I've also seen the word documented workers in the US. I've seen also that reading various papers in different countries, the papers I read. So certainly the image and the figure of the autocrat, the strong man, the strong leader is suggested and comes to mind. I think, or I want to think that this is more of a stage persona, or stage identity that Trump wants to project. And really what matters is the subtle and not so subtle, excuse me, changes, policies put in place. Another thing that I would like to point out is that this move towards the right, towards authoritarianism, it's an international, it's a global tendency. Okay, so you can think about India, and you can think about Turkey and Russia and Italy, and you can think about Hungary, of course. And this doesn't solve the problem. Okay, I'm perfectly aware, just to say it's a trend. One, if I can add a couple of things, another of the most visible consequences of this turn to the right is and will be the silencing of dissent. Okay, which you can see already in a number of contexts. Think about the newly elected president's dislike for the press. Okay, the fake news. Also, his idea of stripping CBS of a broadcasting license because they aired an edited answer of an interview with Harris. This is even thinking about the press and the media. I'm thinking about the enormous and disturbing popularity that X, Elon Musk's platform has. Okay. Also, this question of suffocating dissent is something that I think concerns us as academics, as people working in universities and on campuses. It's an issue that concerns us more directly, both at the level of campus protests, but also at the level of academic freedom, okay, which is the freedom of the faculty to teach the topics and the texts that we consider valuable, that we consider important, instead of being told what texts and what topics are important. And so silencing dissent, suffocating the urban protests also, okay, sending the military. That this goes for me all under the umbrella of authoritarianism. So and in the near future, urban protests, campus protests might encounter a stronger crackdown, okay, which is this escalation, we noticed it since and before, of course, but the moment that they gave this reaction great visibility was the death of George Floyd in 2020. And so all these signals and signs, I don't know, they are highly concerning. And yes, under this respect, yeah, the authoritarianism is there.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Mm.
Either other professors have any thoughts about that question?
I would just say that there's a large body of scholarship and a large number of scholars who study questions and examples of his authoritarianism. And I think that it's a word that gets thrown about, calling Trump a fascist or whatever else, without a great understanding of what these words actually mean, and what we're talking about. And I think what Maurizio has done is given a list of criteria that scholars have identified as warning signs or constitutive of authoritarian or fascist regimes. And there are, I've looked a lot at to a scholar, Ruth Ben-Ghiat at NYU, who talks a lot about this in terms of fascist Italy. But she writes publicly as well. And I think the one key point here is that we've already seen this start, right? We have a first Trump term to use as an example, where this was already beginning. The whole notion of not being, you shouldn't trust the news, or all information was fake or manipulated or not real, destabilizes people's trust in government institutions, right? That's its purpose. So to me, that's the biggest risk, is that Americans are not critical or engaging with evidence and facts with any kind of confidence. And I see that in my own classroom, to be quite honest, not because students don't want to have access to facts or information, but because the kind of destabilizing of confidence in what's official or what you can trust or how to read information, that began eroding before Trump was elected the first time, and has continued to erode, which I think is actually what's sort of priming a lot of the possibilities now that Trump may try to and his administration may make attempts at power grabs that we might have noticed as problematic, or thought about as problematic, that might be something they can get away with because people aren't really sure that it is or it isn't, or that they are doing or not doing something, and how to evaluate what it is that they're observing.
Thank you so much. Professor Blancombe, did you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I wanted to echo Professor Peroni a little bit here. I think it's right that we sometimes use these terms like authoritarian or fascist as just part of political rhetoric. They do mean specific things. There are things that we can look out for. I think part of the danger of overusing those terms is not that we're not sort of warning against the slippery slope that's happening, but really, if the Democratic Party believed that this is a fascist regime coming into power, we're going to just watch while the sort of White House gets handed over. So I think that there's a kind of calling out there of the exaggeration of the rhetoric in the activity of a normal change of power, which is what I hope. I hope it's a normal change of power. I hope we don't have a left-wing January 6th, to be crystal clear. I'm not arguing for that. I just think that the rhetoric has been different from what a lot of people who are part of establishment politics actually even believe. And it's been meant to rile people up, and it's feeding some of the confusion that we're responding to. And then the one thing I would add to this narrative as well is we're seeing this kind of, I think we can fairly call it populist movement, in the sort of positive and negative aspects of that, right? Listening to the people, but also strongman is maybe not a bad way to describe this. We've been seeing this in other countries as well. This has been something that's been going on for at least a decade, like a wave in Europe, South America now, right? Other places. And so what is that a response to? I mean, prior to that, you have decades of what we often call neoliberalism. If that word is a little opaque, it's basically like an international class of people who are like the investing class, who want cheaper labor, who want a certain kind of free trade. And there have been winners and losers of that shift and that regime. And so we're seeing a response, whether or not we can diagnose that as the healthiest response or the best response for working people, that's a separate question. But we see working people who are really angry, and they're turning in many countries in response to the same phenomena towards something that I think my diagnosis would be this is not the right response, but it's good to think about why. And so I think when we're looking at something like populism, like why is it happening? What free trade agreement got signed in the 90s? What sort of turns in the Democratic Party happened under the Clinton administration in the 90s that have produced these reactions today and made people mistrust media, such that we're having a hard time having a conversation about the truth in this moment.
Thank you so much, Professor Blankholm. Thank you to all of our professors for answering that question. I'm going to turn my next question to education, since we are all at a university, you are all educators, and I assume education holds a special place in all of our hearts. My question is about how official curriculum could change after the upcoming transfer of power. So, what are the possible dangers of Trump potentially banning curriculum that addresses inequality, such as the critical race theory, as some states have already done?
I'll jump in here because this is deeply personal for me. I sort of say half jokingly, but not really, with my students, I would definitely have been fired in Florida. I could not teach what I teach in locations that regulate Civil War history. I'm teaching a course on the history of slavery, an upper division course right now on that. I will explain to students what critical race theory is. It's a law school thing for those of you who don't know. It's not happening in kindergarten. But it's been very effectively weaponized to suggest that somehow what those of us who talk about race or gesture to questions about American failures to live up to certain promises, what that means is somehow un-American or somehow unpatriotic, or somehow we are trying to make white students feel bad about themselves, which is a very strange position to take when you're coming from the methodology of a historian, which is, well, we teach what the primary sources tell us. And I don't teach that the Civil War was about slavery because I have a personal vested interest in that being the best answer, but because that's what Confederates said they were fighting for in their declarations of secession, right? So this is tied to the notion of what can be counted as true, and there can be selective things that we will decide are acceptable truths, and other things that are decided are unacceptable truths. Now, what you're getting at here, though, is, well, what policy-wise can happen to make this campus or others like it conform to a model that we're seeing in places like Florida? And my students immediately asked me that last week. And so I've really been thinking a lot about this. And I think a lot of it is really money. I think, Trump has said he wants to get rid of the Department of Education, but what the Department of Education really does is control federal funds. So you could, for example, see, especially if there's a partnership with a Republican Congress, which it appears is in the works, legislation or executive policy that says we are not sending federal dollars to schools that teach X or Y. Mm-hmm. Or those students who want to attend schools that teach X or Y will not be eligible for federal financial aid programs. Mm-hmm. So those are real possibilities. I've also seen suggestions that the Trump administration wants to tax the endowments of institutions that it believes are ideologically opposed to their vision about what is proper education or not, and that they may consider messing with accreditation processes. And accreditation for institutions of higher learning is crucial. I think this is how we evaluate whether or not a university or college is up to snuff in terms of its curriculum. So if you're messing with accreditation standards, you can mess with curriculum. Now, right. I don't necessarily think or imagine that the University of California, for example, is going to decide that scholars like me are worth sacrificing. But I bet that in some locations where this is already a popular idea, controlling information and what kinds of things are taught or not, academic freedom, if you want to call it that. I call it just teaching the sources. They may very well comply with regulations that a Trump administration attempts to put in place to control and police what's taught.
Well, we've seen, thinking about the curriculum per se, we've seen the banning books in schools, in grade schools, okay, in different states, particularly Florida. So in a sort of a vision of academic apocalypse, let's entertain the possibility that this banning is going to happen for higher education, because higher education, in one way or another, is under attack, I think, and it's going to be. So, what would the curriculum look like? And I'm saying this as in a dystopian mode, okay? It's not going to happen. I don't want it to happen. It will not. But books and ideas that are going to be excluded as going to be, yes, text about critical race theory, feminist and gender theory, histories that are not the histories and the history of the victor, to go to Walter Benjamin for a moment. And I don't think that there's going to be, and hopefully definitely not at the University of California, but anywhere, I hope there's not going to be lists of banned books posted on the wall, on the doors of departments or administrative buildings. But as Juliana was saying, there are subtler ways, I mean, through the system of accreditation, for instance, to discourage certain, or the sending around, giving federal money in support of certain colleges or certain department or certain, I don't know. I mean, it sounds slightly conspiratorial and apocalyptic, but if you read papers and you see the people who are being nominated and put in next in positions of power in the next administration, you know, it gives you pause. It makes you think for a moment. The possibly encouraging thing for me comes from my students as well. That resistance also, both at the institutional level, but also at the level of the classroom and outside the classroom. Resistance is possible. I mean, we had a post-election, after 2 days, 2 days after the election, we had a conversation, a discussion in my undergraduate seminar, and of course the mood and the mode was very dismal. It ended up the discussion with, what do we do now? What's there to be done? And one student said, we organize, we read, we speak, we write, we learn here from where we are. And I thought that was incredibly encouraging to me, lifted the mode and the mood of the class a lot. And it came from somebody who's in their early 20s. And that's really good, I thought.
Thank you so much, Professor. Professor Blankholm, do you have anything to add on to this discussion?
I think those are really good answers that help us understand what might happen. And it's good to think about what might happen so that we might think about a response. I have colleagues in Florida, and they've received documents that restrict what they can teach, that tell them what truth is. I have one. I mean, I could share one right now if you want to have a look at one from Florida State. If you want to look at a primary source, we could look at it really quickly. It's pretty interesting. If you don't mind, if I can just use the share button. Okay. Oh, it's not turned on. I'll read it. I'll read it.
Please.
So this is a document that is guidelines given to faculty at Florida State based on statutes, laws that were passed in Florida by their congressional body, signed by their governor. So it says, requirements for all general education courses. Does not distort significant historical events. Does not include a curriculum that teaches identity politics. Is not based on theories that systematic racism, sexism, oppression, and privilege are inherent in the institutions of the United States and were created to maintain social, political, and economic inequities, which is an interesting one. Because if you found any evidence indicating that that was the case, it doesn't matter what the evidence is. You can't say that. And that's the tension that we're talking about here. if you have evidence for something being the case, you're being prohibited from showing that evidence. That's a sharp turn from how the current academy works. There's room for conservative voices in our universities. We have conservative colleagues. We have conservative students. We have conservative grad students. We have wonderful conversations with those people about ideas based in evidence. So telling me what I can't say based on evidence is a big shift, huge turn, big, big difference. That's, I think, what we're worried about here. So I think we should be really clear about what exactly is going on, because a lot of times we end up with false equivalences if we don't. We say, oh, this is being taught, this shouldn't be taught, something like that. Telling people what truth is from a legislative body is extremely dangerous behavior.
I'd
Thank you.
definitely be fired. According to that, I'd definitely be fired.
So would I.
Thank you to all three of our professors so much for taking the time to answer my questions. I'm now going to turn to the audience question portion of this event, where different audience members have sent in questions they would like our panelists to further discuss. So we will start with Jesse's question, which actually is a perfect segue from Professor Blinkholm's answer, which is, could the academic left be becoming as polarizing as the right, labeling dissenters as bigots and pushing rigid narratives? If any of our professors want to take a stab at that question.
I can briefly reiterate, I've read all three of the comments that Jesse's posted into the chat, and I hope other people will ask questions too. So one thing is just, I don't think that all universities should be defined by an idea of the far left. That's not going to get us into any kind of good conversation. That's not exactly what's going on in any sense. And so it's important to draw some of those distinctions. I think that they really matter. And then the other thing I'd say is really simple, which is if there are people on the left who are considering everybody on the so-called right to be a bigot, that's bad thinking too. Don't engage in that. Actually, you know what we're seeing right now, and we're not even going to know fully what we're looking at for a few more years, is a realignment of the two parties. We have a bipartisan system. We like to think we know what's in the Democratic bucket. We like to think we know what's in the Republican bucket. It changes over time, changes issue to issue. Depending on which issue you're voting on, it's going to be hard to figure out how to vote over time, right? And so this whole idea that there is a left and a right and a spectrum that's clear and there's a far left and a far right is one of the beautiful things you can learn about here at a university, how that's not the case. And so I think that as we see a Republican realignment, whether or not the Democrats want to fight for that working class vote, we might see all kinds of things change. But simply calling right-wing people bigots, yeah, absolutely not. But is that what's happening at universities? It's absolutely not. It's not the world I live in. It's not the life I live. So I'll defend my institution. I quite like it here.
Thank you for Professor Blinkholm. Do any of our other panelists have any thoughts on that question?
Well, I completely agree with what Joseph said. I agree with you. It's the polarization is dangerous but again, I insist on the question of I'm thinking about students, in this moment of their lives, of their education, when they are encountering different ideas, different people. There's a whole big spectrum, and it's worth engaging, and not excluding, and not deciding not even to talk to people, but engage and this is the moment to form your opinions and to understand who you are, even in political terms, to confront yourself. So yeah, I agree with you very much.
I'll just add that to me, any kind of ideological extremism signals to me, one, a lack of willingness to engage critically with any number of sources, some of which you may instinctively agree and some of which you may not. But also a lack of empathy, a lack of willingness to come to a table with people from different perspectives and take seriously why they believe the things they do and how they have come to believe the things they do. And that usually involves an understanding, or at least a consideration, of the very things that you can't teach at Florida State, which are sort of large structural parts of American history, or otherwise, depending on where we are. That's my expertise. to help inform us to think about, well, why is it that a voter in one part of the country thinks very differently than I do? You know, I went to the University of Texas. I'm a native Californian. They had no problems with guns. And when you drive through West Texas, you can see why. Because there's not a problem with guns in a place where no one else is living, right? So if you have just some ounce of willingness to engage with people, I think you will avoid those extremes. And it as far as an intellectual activity goes, it's bad pedagogy to teach in extremes.
Mm-hmm.
Telling students what they should believe is
Mm-hmm.
not going to make them believe those things. I have a job to do. I have a method to teach. I have critical thinking to teach. Then they can come and engage with those ideas and with the content that I've assigned on the merits. That's all there is, really, at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, professors. We have another question from the audience. Mitchell Kaufman asked in the chat, or posed the question, that Trump has made comments about this being the last time people need to vote. Should this be considered as a legitimate threat?
Yes, and he also joked today with visiting the White House and talking to Joe Biden about the fact that maybe there's going to be I'm going to have a third term. He said that. So it's been reported. Yeah, please. I just wanted to add this.
Thank you, Professor. Are there any other
I think that's a legitimate threat, actually. And I think I can see a couple of legal arguments taking shape. One, that term limits don't apply to him because these are not consecutive terms, or that he had one stolen from him. There's any number of ways that he can make, I think, specious, but nevertheless serious arguments about staying in office, at least for another term. How likely they would be to succeed is, I don't know. But I think they're real threats.
Thank you, Professor Peroni. Professor Blincombe, any other additional thoughts on that question?
I think Professor Peroni's analysis is excellent, and also the hesitancy where we are in a bit of a wait and see mode. And so we can have expectations, but until certain things indicate that this is now the plan, I think it's difficult to predict what exactly might take place.
Perfect. And Professor Nomi has a question for the panelists, which is, can the checks and balances stop President-elect Trump from being above the law? Which is kind of in the same vein as our previous question.
No, not right now. Because if the entire government is staffed by his people, and Congress is unwilling to do its job, which they have, even with Democrats in power, at least in part of of Congress, I think you're not going to see normal, or at least what we consider customary checks and balances actually play out, or that there will be any kind of holding to account. I think that's actually the biggest threat.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor Peroni. And we have another question from Amy Gilson asking the panelists to speak on Project 2025 despite Trump's effort to distance himself from it. And do the panelists believe that he will support or follow that in his term, or what that could look like potentially in the future?
Here's where I would suggest that looking at other social movements for patterns of resistance is a good sort of strategy. In my academic circles, some of which are almost exclusively lawyers, they've been planning for Project 2025 since it became available, and the expectation is that yes, a Trump administration will pursue this to varying degrees. How successfully they'll be able to do that for a variety of reasons remains to be seen. But I do think there will be attempts to institute pieces of it. And I think that lawyers are already planning for resistance.
which is encouraging.
Professor Blancombe, did you have any thoughts on that question?
No, I think that analysis is right. I mean, the office of the president is not the office of a dictator, and there are checks throughout the system and ways of sort of slowing things down. I mean, I think the question probably hints at how Project 2025 is in some ways a plan to change the bureaucracies that slowed down Trump in his first term. And so I'm sure that it'll be a more effective use of power now that they're so shocked to have actually be in power, which is very much the case in 2016. So I think it'll be a more effective administration, but I guess I don't see yet why we should think that all normal rules or checks are going to be thrown out.
Well,
Perfect.
going back to this question, can I just add, excuse me, following, yeah, I mean, I want to hope, what the Professor Blancholm was explaining now, but going back to Professor Perone's answer, that no checks and balances, the system of checks and balances cannot stop Trump. I just want just a little, just very little observation. Yes, this is not authoritarianism, perhaps, since we were objecting to the word, to the line, authoritarianism, fascism. I didn't use the word fascism, but certainly it's very anti-democratic. You're just not abiding to the system on which a big important part of the on which the system of American democracy is based.
I think it's worth noting that there are some checks and balances that are specifically articulated in the Constitution, and then there are those that have come to be expectations that have developed over time and are really more like customs. And some analysis of Trump versus the United States, the Supreme Court case that gave quite broad immunity or presumptive immunity to a sitting president for official acts. I have heard some analysis that this is a signal to Congress that they are in fact the ones, according to the Constitution, responsible for holding a president accountable for bad acts, and that power is exclusively resides within Congress. Now, I don't know that I believe that that's in fact what the court is saying, but I do think that's interesting to think about in the context of there actually are provisions to handle a president who is operating outside either what's constitutionally there, even a sort of, and I hesitate to say this, a sort of historical understanding of what the office of the presidency should look like, which the court is not getting right, and what we expect of presidents, right? That actually matters. What the people think the president should do or be matters a lot. So if Congress and the court are going to be unwilling to do certain things, and I think that there's reason to believe that they are going to be unwilling to do the things that they might otherwise have been up to doing. We can think about the Nixon scandal, the Watergate scandal as the point of comparison on that. Then the check that remains is the people. And whether or not Americans will tolerate going down certain roads or not. So, for example, an abortion ban at the federal level is an incredibly dumb political move. They might still do it, but it's an incredibly dumb political move. And so I would imagine that they're not going to pursue that. Precisely because the people have already made clear they won't accept it.
Thank you so much, Professor Peroni. That was actually all the time we had for questions from the audience. So I just personally want to give a huge thank you to our participants for inquiring with our panelists, and a huge thank you to our panelists for spending their afternoon talking with us in a time that feels pretty tumultuous for part of the country. I feel so grateful that we could all come together in our UCSB community, specifically in HFA, and talk about these issues. And as a reminder, this event will be posted to the HFA a YouTube channel in case anybody is curious to rewatch. And if you look in the chat, we will have links to find our Instagram, our Facebook, and our TikTok. So thank you again to everybody for showing up and participating to relive the 2020 COVID days on Zoom. And I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank
Thanks so
you.
much.
Thank you very much. Mhm.